So let me begin with. All right. So warm greetings to all of you, colleagues, and I welcome you to our official first lecture session for AUI 3702 in this first semester of the 2025 academic year. So my name is Mr. Privilege, and I'm the tutor here at Grad that will be facilitating your colleagues with respect to the module outline related to this module. So what you see currently projected on the screen, it's an outline of the topics of note pertinent to this module. So essentially, there's about 7 topics of note, and I would endeavor to break it down for you so that you have an in-depth understanding on what is expected of you with regards to each one of the topics. And I will also be pointing out important examinable items, what I regard as assumed knowledge to not as far as the module is concerned in terms of what they examine you for exam purposes and as well as for assignment purposes, especially when dealing with an essay-based assignment, right? So let's get into that right away. So the first topic, colleagues, it's relating to the International Professional Practice Framework requirements and guidance for performing engagement procedures, tests of controls, right? Tests of controls. I'm going to teach you guys the notion around test of controls. It's very important to have an understanding of the background, knowledge around the principles of test of controls and where it is applicable, mostly when dealing with an essay-based question. Topic number 2 deals with an aspect or an element to do with corporate governance. And I would give you guidelines around that as well. Topic 3 deals with control-based practices. Control-based practices for conducting engagement procedures. So it's still part and parcel of test of controls as well. And then in topic 4, we're going to look at the internal audit process. The internal audit process is basically made up of several steps. So obviously you have your pre-engagement stage, followed of course by your planning, performing of the audit engagement, reporting, and then follow-ups, right? Follow-up and monitoring, basically, right? So, but we're going to talk about the in-depth side of the internal audit process, of course, when we get to topic number 4 of this module. Topic 5 deals with developing engagement procedures, developing engagement procedures, right? The part about engagement procedures, it's important to note that it also incorporates test of controls. But then there's also substantive audit procedures that forms part of engagement procedures. So basically, engagement procedures in a general perspective, it's those specific actions or steps which the auditor carry out in order to gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. That's what an engagement procedure really is. So when you look at working papers, for instance, right, those will be your specific instructions given by the chief audit executive, for example, or your senior internal auditor, to guide you as to what you need to do in order to collect evidence to substantiate or to support your audit file. Does it make sense, colleagues?
Yes, it does.
Right. So that's an element on topic number 5. Topic number 6 deals with developing.
Yes, sir.
Oh, lovely. I think it was the network slowness there. Anyways, so topic 6 deals with developing engagement procedures for the different business cycles. This is really where I'm going to begin in tonight's engagement. Developing engagement procedures for the different business cycles. one of the most important topics in this module, right? And then topic 7 deals, of course, with reporting the results of the engagement, which is reporting the results of the engagement procedures. It's still also there's a bit on and parcel of test of controls there. But anyways, this particular topic, it's one which was also tested in your assignment number 1. If you looked at your question 1 and question 2 of your assignment, it was centered on topic 7 in your study guide. But then, of course, your point of reference to this would be chapter 7 in the internal audit and introduction, that green book. Excuse me. If you go to chapter 7 of that textbook, it deals with reporting the results of an engagement, right? So basically that's what you saw with your first assignment, questions number 1, question number 2, that working paper that they wanted you guys to complete. It was more pertinent to topic number 7. Anyways, so that was just to give you guys an outline overview regarding to the topics of note, which we are going to cover as far as AUI 3702 is concerned. Now, I've pointed out the importance about topic 6, developing engagement procedures for the different business cycle. Now, the reason why I'm saying topic 6 is important, and it can actually be attributed as the center of this module anyways, because most of these other principles that you see in other respective topics in there, they are centered on this particular topic in any case. So why am I saying that? Because, for instance, if you look at topic 1, right, they are saying performing engagement procedures, tests of controls. So when you're performing test of controls, you'll be performing test of controls over a specific business cycle. So that business cycle, it can be, for instance, inventory and production cycle, for example. It can be acquisitions and payment cycle, or what they normally call purchases and payment cycle. It can be revenue and receipt cycle. It can also be payroll and personnel, or what they call a human resource and payroll cycle. And last but not least, of course, bank and finance cycle. So it can be, they can literally test the test of controls relating to any one of these enlisted business cycles. So that therefore mean your understanding or your knowledge base regarding to business cycles comes handy when dealing with this module. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Yes, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So it follows then that your knowledge base on business cycles comes handy for the purpose of this module. You really need to have an in-depth knowledge background regarding to the business cycles. I'm going to introduce one of the business cycles tonight, right? But anyways, what is it that you need to know from those business cycles, which would be examinable for exam purposes anyways? So that's what I call assumed knowledge, or your examinable items. So if you look into, for instance, past exam papers in this module, you'll discover that most of the questions which the lecturer or the examiner brings into the question paper, right, it will be centered on specific phases or a specific function in the cycle or a specific stage in the cycle. So when I'm saying function, I'm really referring to the same thing as saying a particular stage. Maybe it can be a stage or a particular phase in the revenue and receipt cycle. So when I'm talking about these things, I'm referring to something like this, which I'm going to portray shortly in my notes. It's going to project in a moment. Okay, so I'll use the purchases and payment cycle, for instance. Right? So the functions or stages or phases I'm referring to this. So for instance, if you look at the purchases and payment cycle, what they call acquisitions and payment cycle, the first stage or function, it has to do with determining the need for goods or services. And there are activities that will take place there. which you need to be acquainted on, so that you can be able to respond to the kind of questions that they would examine you guys on. So, and then of course, followed by ordering of goods and services. Then receiving of goods and services is the third stage. And the fourth stage is the recording of the purchases, where in the accounting records, obviously. And then lastly, payment and recording of credit purchase. This is not really the final stage. There's the final stage is stage number 6, because there can be a case that even if you have already paid for the goods and they've been delivered to you, they might be defective. So you might not be happy with the goods and you can choose to return them. And that's where the 6th stage comes into the picture, which is goods returns. But we're going to deal with that in a greater detail as we progress. So in any case, it's the phases and functions or stages, I think I've just illustrated so that at least you have perspective to say, what am I referring to? So what the examiner would do normally, they'll bring an essay-based question, which is the same thing as a system description, right? For a specific stage or for a specific function in a particular cycle. So they'll tell you that, okay, the ordering function operates like this, like that. These are the people that are actively involved, documents that are being used, and stuff like that. So they will explain the entire process taking place at a particular stage. That's what you would find normally portrayed in your QPs, your question papers, right? So now when you get that, you should therefore then be in a position where you can be able to identify people that are involved, and even in certain instances, even the departments that are actively participating in a particular stage in that cycle. You should also be capacitated enough to identify documents and the records that are being maintained or used. You should also, now this, or the first 3 things that I've pointed out to you, these are things you need to know, especially when you study business cycles, all right? Yes, you need to know the stages for each cycle respectively, but in knowing the stages or those functions in the cycle, that also mean or imply that you are able to identify people that are actively involved at each one of those respective stages. And that also implies you are able to know what documents are being generated or rather produced in each one of those respective stages, and how those documents flow from one stage to the other, something of that sort. So that helps you to gain light regarding to the business cycles themselves. Now, if you have that knowledge, here's what the examiner can then examine you on, or rather what they can test you on. They will then ask you to identify weaknesses in the system description. So after they've given you that essay where they're explaining how activities, or rather how operations are taking place in that stage, they'll then ask you to identify weaknesses, meaning to say areas where controls are non-existent, or instances in that stage where controls are not really being effectively discharged to achieve purpose. That's what weaknesses are in a simple term. They can also then ask you to identify risks in the system description, right? Now, a weakness and a risk are 2 completely different things. One is more like a red flag, so to speak, and that's what we call a weakness. So it's a red flag that something that just simply indicates or shows that something is not being done right in the activities being performed in the organization. Now, if those indicators are not addressed, you can therefore end up encountering undesired results, and that's what we call risk. So a risk, obviously, it's anything that can hinder the achievement of the set objectives, or basically it can be a threat to the organization, or threats to your set performance objectives, as a department, for example, right? It can also be regarded as what could potentially go wrong. So if you don't respond to the red flags, which are clearly being depicted on the ways that you're doing things, what are the undesired outcomes rather, or what are the potential and undesired results that could potentially occur? That's what a risk really is. So I'm just trying to help you to disseminate the differences between a weakness and a risk, because the two, they are really not the same. Then, of course, they can also ask you to give recommendations, right? Which is more or less an internal control measure. Now, a recommendation can be given to address a weakness. A recommendation can also be given to address a risk. Now, it depends with the structure of the question that they've given you. Sometimes they can ask you for weaknesses and recommendations. Sometimes they can ask you for risks and recommendations. Or in other instances, I've noticed this a lot, especially at third year, at honors level. But even at third, they can also do the same, where they ask you to identify weaknesses and to also give the risk descriptions on the other column. So it will be like a two-column structure in how they want you to portray the answer, for instance. So it can be something like this. So on the one column, you're showing the weakness. Just a second, guys. You're showing the weakness, and then on the other column, you're really showing the risk here. Okay. Let me just, I really don't like this color. It's too dark. But anyway, so on the other side, you're showing the risk over there, right? And sometimes they can then add the column for recommendation there. So it can be a three-column question where on the one column, you're indicating the weakness. And if that weakness is not addressed, what is the undesired outcome that could occur, which is a risk? And then on the other end, you then give a recommentative action that they can actually implement. Now, notice if it's like this, colleagues, you need to ensure that your recommendation addresses the weakness instead. Because the weakness is the root of the problem. So the problem is the risk. But what is it that caused this undesired risk to occur, on the undesired result to occur? It is the weakness. Hence, when you get a question like this, where they want the weaknesses, they want the risk description, and then they want you to give recommendations, ensure that your recommendation statement or the internal control measure you recommend, it is directly addressed towards the weakness that you've identified. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yes. So it's very, very important, right? And so, but like I said, sometimes it can be just a case where they ask you for weaknesses and they can ask you for recommendations as a follow-up question, or it can even just be a case of weaknesses and risks only without even the recommendations being required. So it all depends. But what does that therefore imply for you as a student? It implies you need to have a a clear understanding of what a weakness really is, a clear understanding of what a risk is, how does it differ from a weakness, and then, of course, a clear and thorough understanding of what a recommendation is, or rather what a control measure is. Now, notice, colleagues, that when you're dealing with business cycles, right, we pointed out that you need to identify people involved. People can also act as a form of a control measure that is in place within a division. We also pointed out that you need to be able to identify documents and records that are being used. Those records, audit trail, right? It can also act as a form of a control measure, right? But in other instances, you also have that, especially with this fourth industrial revolution that we are in, most of business records or other activities of entities, they are really computerized, right? Think of a human resource department. Most of their activities or functions, they're being done over the computer using systems and programs and all of that. So now, when it comes to a setup like that, right, it means that the kind of controls you would find in such an environment like that, they are programmed internal controls, or basically computerized internal controls. So it also follows that when you think of recommendations, or rather when you think of controls, check the environment which you are dealing with, or the environment that has been portrayed in the system description that has been conveyed to you. You need to look into that to say, okay, what kind of environment is this? Is it a manual environment, or perhaps is it a computerized environment? Meaning to say everything is being done on a particular system within the computer. It's very important to have that dissemination so that even your recommendations as you portray them, it is going to be relevant to the environment, the business environment in which the client is involved in, right? So I just thought, let me portray that to you. But I will explain to you the principles about internal controls in detail so that you disseminate the differences between your manual internal controls and your computerized internal controls. Because these are two different type of controls. On the one side, your manual controls, or rather internal controls, these are non-programmed internal controls. So it can be anything that can be done outside of the computer. So you can have certain control activities being performed that don't really require the involvement of a computer. And that can be in form of a policy or certain standard procedures that they give you as guidelines to say, guys, when we process a transaction from stage A all the way to stage D, what do we do from point A to point B before we get to point D? So it can act as some form of an instruction, that is being given to employees to follow. So those instructions or directives, so to speak, right? They act as examples of what I would regard as manual internal controls. But the moment I'm seeing that whilst you are processing a transaction in the system, before you can get to the next stage, maybe say you are submitting an application on the website, say, of a supplier. And then they say, before you can submit an order on their platform, right? Before you can submit an order on their platform, you need to accept their terms and conditions before it allows you to click submit. That follows that there is a computerized internal control which they've programmed within their systems, right? And how do we test to really ascertain ourselves that these controls exist? So that's where those engagement procedures, or rather test of controls, come into the picture, where you have to either reperform a certain transaction on the system, to determine whether the system would reject processing further without you accepting the terms and conditions, for example. So I'm just trying to help you picture, the kind of things you are going to be dealing with, especially when you are drafting tests of controls. It's very important to take note that you can find certain controls being outside of a computerized environment, and you would find certain controls really being, within a computerized environment. So if it's like that, what kind of approach would you apply? How would you formulate your test of controls? You see, those are the kind of questions that should be popping up in your mind, right? Because audit environments will not always be the same. They'll be different. So you get clients whereby, look, they don't really get to do most of their activities within a computer, right? Think of a construction company, for instance. Most of their activities, they are really manual in nature, not so much not so much involvement of a computerized system as such, So let's say you're doing an operational audit over a site activity, or maybe say they are building a road construction from Pretoria to Witbank, right? And you want to perform an operational audit for say a construction company that has been granted a tender, for instance, to perform such an activity. So when you're doing your test of controls in such an environment like that, you discover that most of the controls that you're going to be testing, they are really manual controls. There's not so much of a computerized controls that you'll be auditing, or rather that you'll be testing per se. But now that's a different environment altogether, as compared to if you are auditing a client, say, for instance, a financial institution, right? A bank could be a good example that I can give you, right? So if you're auditing a financial institution like a bank, you discover that most of their transactions, so to speak, they are really done within the computer. So you might discover maybe it's something to do with the approval process of loans to consumers or to clients. So you want to audit them the efficiency, maybe, and effectiveness of the process. So when you perform test of controls in an environment like that, you will discover that most of the controls that you'll be testing in that environment, they are likely going to be computerized controls. So for instance, when they do a credit check on a client, right, there has to be credit limits that will be set. How do you know that indeed there's a credit limit that was set for the clients that the bank have granted loans to? How would you check that? Do you really need to get some papers somewhere so that you can manually audit or test them? Or do you really need to go through their credit facility systems to really ascertain whether it allows, for instance, setting of credit limits, that indeed it allows for capturing of the audit trail that substantiate that indeed background checks were done to confirm the credit worthiness of a consumer before the loan was granted to the customer of the bank, So I'm saying all of this to say that environments for auditing purposes, they would not always be the same. There are those which are really going to be manual in nature. So if they are more manual in nature, it means there's less involvement of computer processing, so to speak. Whereas there are going to be instances where you are auditing a computerized environment where most of the controls, they are really programmed internal controls. I hope it's making sense to you, colleagues. Hello?
Yes, it does.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Right. So I thought I should lay that foundation. And then so now so I've already explained, I think, point number 6 about the recommendation. And then, of course, in certain instances, or rather under normal circumstances, you'll be requested to draft audit procedures. Now, when you talk of audit procedures, you need to know that there are 2 types of audit procedures. It's either it's test of controls or it's substantive audit procedures and analytical procedures. So analytical procedure, it's really a substantive audit procedure. All right, it falls within the umbrella of substantive audit procedures. I'm just looking for my charger. Just a second, colleagues. Oh, my device switches off. So a substantive audit, analytical procedure, it's a really a substantive audit procedure in nature. It's just that how it differs, say, from the rest of the other type of substantive audit procedures, that with analytical procedures, you are doing more of comparison of details, whether the detail is historic in nature or it's present data or information that you have presented to you, or you're comparing with projected information, right? So like, for instance, budgets. So you're comparing, obviously, when you're doing a comparison of budgets, you'd need to look at the previous performance of the organization. How did they perform in the previous financial year? And how are they performing now? Right? You can use your historic information as a benchmark to measure current performance, or you can measure current performance against what you intended to achieve, meaning to say projected information. So you can also be comparing those 2. So that's more of your analytical procedure. So it's more of comparisons of either historic detail, present detail, against projected detail or projected data, right? So that's analytical procedures in nature. I'll explain the notion around it in a greater detail with examples as we get to that stage. Then number 8, you will be expected to draft audit objectives. Now, audit objectives and audit procedures are not the same. 2 different things altogether. Audit procedures, these are instructions given to auditors to perform so that they can gather audit evidence. That's audit procedures. Audit objectives is really what the auditor intends to achieve by performing the audit procedures. In other words, by performing those audit tasks. Why are you doing those tasks? Why are you reviewing documents? Why inquiring with certain personnel in a particular department? Why are you doing walkthrough tests to observe certain activities that are being carried out? Why are you doing all of those things? The purpose behind your actions of performance of certain tasks, that's what we call audit objectives. So even the way you formulate audit objectives is not the same way you draft audit procedures. These are two complete ends of the spectrum altogether, but they're interrelated somewhat, right? So colleagues, this was me trying to portray and simplify AUI 3702 to you so that at least even when you do your personal study, you have clear direction to say, okay, so where do we start? What do I need to know? So what you need to start with first is to have a good and clear background understanding of business cycles. If you can master the blueprint within each one of these business cycles, if you have at least a good understanding of the blueprint of each one of these business cycles, it will become easier to answer and to respond to questions whereby they can ask you to identify weaknesses or risks and giving recommendations, or even perhaps where they ask you to formulate audit procedures or perhaps even drafting audit objectives. It will become easier because you know exactly what is taking place, in each one of those respective cycles. So the examiner can choose any one of these business cycles. Like for instance, if you look at your first assignment, right? Particularly, I think it was the third question, if I'm correct. That third question, if you look at it, it was more to do with payment to was it to suppliers or something? Let me check if I still, I think, oh no, it's not on this device. It's on the other laptop, yeah. But essentially it was something to do with bank and finance because they were doing some payments for something, right? But in any case, I'll give you a thorough, proper example as we, introduce most of these other principles in detail, right? But so far with what I've explained, do you guys have any questions? Any questions?
I personally don't have a question yet, but
Mhm.
maybe just to go back, I think you were referring to a question whereby I think it was about a school and the school fees payment processes that takes
Mhm.
place with the finance clerks and everyone mentioned there.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I don't know if you want us to maybe visit that part and
Okay.
maybe check the weaknesses and controls that are put in place there, or maybe we can move on. I don't know, but just to go back there, it
Oh,
was about the school and payment processes of the school fees.
oh, okay. Yeah. So you see, in activity like that, right, where it's because it's a service basically, right? So the school is offering educational services in exchange of revenue, right? So to be more directive on that, it's really this. It's revenue and receipt cycle, but on the service side of things. Let me show you. Of course, there's a bit of an element about bank and finance, but you see, bank and finance, it would deal a lot with loans and stuff. So, but in such a setup like that, where there's a service or a physical product that is being sold in exchange of receiving income for that, it will be more of revenue and receipt cycle. Let me show you guys something. To show just in a moment. You see this textbook, this one, orange, the orange textbook, Performing Internal Audit Engagement, 6th edition. This is where you would find everything to do with business cycles. It's all in here. So this should be your best friend as far as this AUI 3702 is concerned.
There.
Yebo. Yeah. Yes, I'm
Hi,
listening.
sir.
Yes, I'm listening.
Do you mind sharing the PDF textbook?
Yeah, showcase. I will. I will. Colleagues, we're left with a
Thank you,
minute. We
sir.
might need to reconnect. Is it okay? We might need to
It's okay.
reconnect. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
And then I'll explain what I wanted to explain on regarding to the textbook short in the second part of this lesson.